Tonight, we follow a quiet road through the lands of Middle-earth, a long road that leads north toward the hidden valley of Rivendell. Far behind lies the white city of Gondor and the ancient ruins of Osgiliath, where Boromir once stood watch beneath the moon. Now he travels alone through forests and silent valleys, guided only by the stars and the distant call of the mountains. If you enjoy peaceful fantasy stories like this one, consider subscribing to Nightfall Stories, where new journeys through the worlds of fantasy arrive each week. And now, settle in, relax, and walk the quiet road to Rivendell. Night lay quietly upon Minas Tirith, and the white city rested beneath a sky filled with steady stars. From afar, the city seemed almost like a mountain of pale stone rising from the darkness of the plains. Tier upon tier of walls and courts climbed the shoulder of the mountain Mindoluin, until at the highest point stood the Tower of Ecthelion, slender and watchful above the sleeping land. In the late hours of the night, when most lamps had been dimmed and only the quiet watch of the guards remained, Minas Tirith felt very old. The streets were empty. The fountains murmured softly in shadowed courtyards. The banners upon the high walls stirred in the slow wind that came down from the mountains. In those hours, the city seemed to remember its long history, the victories, the griefs, and the centuries of vigilance that had shaped the people of Gondor. In one of the upper circles of the city, within the citadel where the rulers of Gondor had dwelt for generations, a chamber window stood open to the night air. There slept Boromir, captain of the White Tower. His rest should have been deep. Only the day before, he had returned from the eastern marches, where the broken city of Osgiliath still stood as a battered shield between Gondor and the shadow rising from the east. The ride had been long, and the weariness of patrol usually brought swift sleep. Yet this night was different, for Boromir dreamed. First, the dream seemed no more than a distant memory of travel. He walked upon a road that wound northward between hills. The air was cool, and the scent of pine and running water filled the wind. This was not the land of Gondor. The hills were steeper, the forests deeper, and the sky seemed somehow clearer, as though the world there had not been dimmed by long years of war. Boromir followed the road. He did not know why. In dreams, a man often walks without question, guided by something deeper than reason. The path climbed slowly through the hills, until at last it opened onto a narrow valley, hidden between steep slopes. Boromir paused there. Before him lay a place unlike any he had seen. A river ran bright over stones worn smooth by centuries of water. Tall trees rose along its banks, their branches whispering softly together. Among those trees stood halls and terraces of pale stone, built not as a fortress, but as part of the valley itself, as though the land had welcomed them. Light shone gently in those halls. It was not the hard glow of torches or the red flicker of war fires. Instead, it was calm and golden, like the last light of evening lingering beneath leaves. Though Boromir had never seen this valley before, something in his heart told him it was ancient, older than the kingdoms of men, older perhaps even than the towers of Gondor. Dawn came slowly over Minas Tirith. At first, the eastern sky grew pale above the distant shadow of the mountains. The stars faded one by one, and a quiet gray light spread across the plains of the Pelennor fields below the city walls. Soon the first rays of the sun touched the highest tower, and the white stone of the city began to glow softly in the morning light. Within the citadel, the day had already begun. Messengers moved through the courts. Guards changed their watch along the walls, and the sound of hooves echoed faintly in the lower levels, where riders prepared for patrol. Minas Tirith was never truly stilled for long, for the realm of Gondor stood ever on guard. Yet, in the upper courts that morning, there was another kind of movement. Boromir walked alone along the high stone path that led toward the stables of the citadel. He wore no armor now, only a dark riding cloak, fastened at the shoulder with a silver clasp bearing the emblem of the white tree. At his side hung the sword he had carried through many battles along the eastern river. His steps were steady, but his thoughts were far away. The dream had not left him. Its words remained clear in his memory, spoken with a weight that did not fade with waking. He had heard the verses before in half-forgotten tales of the North, stories preserved among the lore masters of Gondor, yet never had they seemed meant for him until now. Boromir paused for a moment beside the high wall of the citadel and looked eastward. Far beyond the green fields and silver river lay lands that Gondor had watched for centuries. The broken lands beyond Osgiliath, and farther still, the dark regions where the power of the enemy gathered once more. It was toward those lands that Boromir's thoughts usually turned. Yet the dream had pointed another way, north, toward a place called Rivendell, known in ancient speech as Imladris. Few men of Gondor had seen that valley in many long years. It lay far beyond the borders of the Southern Kingdoms, hidden among the wild lands of the north, where the road passed through ancient forests and forgotten ruins. Boromir had never traveled so far from home. Still, he did not doubt the road before him. The dream had come more than once, and in the House of Denethor, such dreams were not lightly ignored. At the stables, a small horse waited, already saddled. The animal was strong and steady, bred in the southern lands along the Anduin, where the riders of Gondor trained their mounts for long journeys. It lifted its head as Boromir approached, breathing softly into the cool morning air. Boromir rested a hand upon its neck. "You and I will see long roads together," he said quietly. A stable hand nearby bowed his head respectfully, but did not ask questions. Word had already passed through the citadel that the captain of the White Tower would ride north that morning on an errand of the steward's house. Such matters were not often spoken openly. Boromir fastened his cloak and checked the straps of the saddle carefully. He carried little baggage, only what was needed for a long journey. A travel pack, provisions for several days, and a small roll of maps carefully wrapped against the weather. The road ahead would be uncertain. He mounted smoothly and turned the horse toward the descending streets of the city. The gates of Minas Tirith lay many circles below. As he rode downward through the quiet streets, the city began to wake around him. Bakers opened their doors. Merchants carried goods toward the lower markets. Children ran along the narrow lanes, chasing one another beneath the tall white walls. Many paused when they saw Boromir pass. He was well known among the people of the city. Soldiers saluted as he rode by, and several townsfolk bowed their heads in greeting. Boromir acknowledged them with a quiet nod. He had always loved Minas Tirith, not only its towers and walls, but the people who lived within them. The strength of Gondor had never rested solely in stone or steel. It lived in its people. At last he reached the great gate. The massive doors of iron and wood stood open, and the guards there stepped aside as Boromir approached. Beyond the gate, the wide road wound downward across the outer slopes toward the Pelennor fields. Boromir paused a moment beneath the shadow of the gatehouse. Behind him rose the white city, tall and enduring against the mountain. Before him stretched the long road northward into lands he had never seen. He took one last look at the city of his birth. Then he turned his horse toward the road. The journey to Rivendell had begun. The morning wind moved gently across the fields as Boromir rode away from the walls of Minas Tirith. Farmers already worked among the green lands of the Pelennor, tending crops that fed the city through every season of watchfulness and war. Soon the white walls behind him began to fade into the distance. The road curved northward along the great river Anduin, whose waters had long marked the eastern boundary of Gondor's strength. Boromir followed its course. For many leagues, the river would guide him, carrying him past watch posts and quiet villages, past lands both fair and troubled. Beyond those lands waited the plains near Rohan, and beyond them still the wild and ancient regions of the north. The distance was great, yet Boromir did not fear it. He had ridden through war and darkness before. And somewhere far beyond the horizon lay the hidden valley from his dream, the place where answers waited among the wise. So began the long road of Boromir, son of Denethor, a road that would lead him across half of Middle-earth before its end. And though he did not yet know it, that road would carry him toward a meeting that would change the fate of the world. The road north from Minas Tirith ran long and pale beside the wide waters of the Anduin. For many leagues it followed the eastern edge of the Pelennor fields, where green farmland stretched between low stone walls and small villages that had endured for generations beneath the protection of the White City. In the early hours of the morning, the land seemed calm and welcoming. Mist still lingered in the hollows near the river, drifting slowly across the fields as the sun climbed higher into the sky. Boromir rode steadily along that road. His horse moved at an easy pace, conserving strength for the long journey ahead. Though the road was well kept and familiar to many riders of Gondor, Boromir knew that his path would soon lead far beyond the borders of lands he had known all his life. For now, however, the countryside felt peaceful. Farmers worked among the fields, guiding plows through rich soil. Shepherds moved their flocks along gentle hills. Smoke rose in thin lines from cottages where the day's first fires had been lit. Many who saw Boromir pass paused in their work. The captains of the White Tower was known throughout the lands near Minas Tirith. Word of his deeds in the defense of Gondor had spread far beyond the walls of the city. Some bowed their heads respectfully as he rode by, while others simply watched the tall rider in silence, recognizing the emblem of the white tree upon his cloak. Boromir returned their greetings with quiet nods. He did not linger long in the villages. Though he loved these lands deeply, his thoughts were already turning toward the long miles ahead. The dream had not left him. Even beneath the clear light of morning, he can still recall the hidden valley he had seen while sleeping, the river running bright beneath trees, the terraces of pale stone among the forest, and the calm voice that had spoken words older than the kingdoms of men. Imladris. A name lingered in his thoughts. Among the lore masters of Gondor, the valley was known by another name, Rivendell. It was said to lie far in the north, beyond lands where the power of Gondor reached. There dwelt Elrond, one of the ancient lords of the elves, whose wisdom stretched back into the elder days of Middle-earth. Boromir had heard tales of that place since childhood, yet they had always seemed distant, like legends belonging to a world older than the struggles of Gondor. Now he rode toward it. The road curved gently away from the Pelennor as the day wore on. Soon the fields grew fewer, replaced by wider stretches of open land where the river flowed quietly beside long banks of reeds and willow trees. The Anduin was broad there. Its waters moved slowly but with great strength, reflecting the sky like a ribbon of silver stretching toward the distant north. Boromir often glanced toward the river as he rode. For many years, the Anduin had marked the eastern frontier of Gondor's vigilance. Across its waters lay lands where the shadow had grown stronger with each passing decade. Though Boromir now rode northward rather than east, he could not forget that truth. The long war between Gondor and the dark powers beyond the river was never far from his thoughts. By midday, the road had grown quieter. The villages lay farther apart now, and the riders he passed were mostly messengers or guards moving between distant watchposts. Several recognized Boromir and exchanged brief words of greeting before continuing on their own errands. Most of the time, however, he rode alone. Solitude did not trouble him. A soldier of Gondor often spent long hours riding the marches with only wind and river for company. Yet, this journey felt different from any patrol he had ridden before. There was no clear enemy to face, no fortress to defend, only distance and the strange certainty that the dream which had sent him north carried meaning yet unseen. The road climbed slightly as afternoon approached. From a low ridge, Boromir paused and looked back southward. Far away in the distance, the white shape of Minas Tirith could still be glimpsed faintly against the mountains. Even at such distance, the city's towers caught the sunlight like pale fire. For a moment, Boromir remained still. The sight stirred a familiar feeling in him. Pride, certainly, but also responsibility. Gondor had endured for long centuries because its people did not abandon their watch. Every soldier who rode its borders carried that duty with him. Boromir turned his horse north again. The white city slowly vanished behind the hills. Ahead, the road stretched onward beside the Anduin, leading him toward lands that grew less familiar with each passing mile. As evening approached, the light softened across the river valley. The wind cooled, and long shadows stretched across the road. Boromir chose a small rise overlooking the river, where several old trees offered shelter from the wind. There he made his first camp of the journey. The routine was simple. He unsaddled the horse and allowed it to graze among the grass near the riverbank. A small fire was kindled beneath the trees, just large enough to warm the evening meal he carried in his pack. The sounds of the countryside slowly faded as darkness returned. Birds settled among the branches. The wind whispered softly through the leaves. And the river continued its endless journey northward. Boromir sat beside the small fire and watched the waters of the Anduin. He wondered how many travelers before him had followed this same road toward distant lands. Kings, messengers, soldiers, wanderers. The river had seen them all pass through the centuries. Now it watched him. The stars began to appear once more above the valley. Boromir wrapped his cloak around his shoulders and leaned back against the trunk of the tree. Sleep would come soon, and perhaps the dream would return. For somewhere beyond the long leagues of Middle-earth lay the valley he had seen, a place of counsel, of ancient wisdom, and of answers not yet understood. Toward that place he rode, and the road beside the Anduin carried him steadily onward, into the deepening north. Morning returned quietly along the banks of the Anduin. A pale mist lay across the water when Boromir woke beside his small camp. The river moved slowly beneath the early light, its wide surface reflecting the faint colors of dawn. For a few moments, he remained still, listening to the soft sounds of the waking land, the distant cry of water birds, the quiet movement of the wind through the tall grasses, and the steady breath of his horse grazing nearby. It was a peaceful hour. Yet Boromir's thoughts soon turned once more to the road. He rose, stirred the dying embers of the fire, and prepared for the day's ride. The journey north would be long, and though the first miles had been easy, he knew the road ahead would grow lonelier as he left the familiar lands of Gondor behind. Before long, he was riding again. The road beside the Anduin bent slowly northwest now, following the curve of the great river as it wound through the wide valley. The land had begun to change. The rich farmland of the Pelennor had given way to open stretches of grass and scattered woodland where only a few small farms stood along the road. Boromir welcomed the quiet. He had spent many years riding the borders of Gondor, and the rhythm of long travel felt natural to him. The steady movement of horse and rider, the wind across the open land, the sound of distant water. These things allowed the mind to wander freely. Often his thoughts returned to the dream. The hidden valley had felt real in a way that ordinary dreams rarely did. Even now, waking beneath the open sky, he could remember the sound of the river running through that distant place and the calm light shining among its halls. Rivendell. Few in Gondor had seen it, yet the old records of the kingdom spoke of that valley with deep respect. There dwelt Elrond, a lord of the Eldar, whose wisdom was said to stretch back into the earliest days of Middle-earth. Boromir had never spoken with an elf of such age. The thought stirred both curiosity and caution within him. The road continued north through lands that grew wilder with each passing league. By midday, the last villages of southern Gondor had disappeared behind him. Only the occasional watchpost remained, where soldiers kept quiet guard along the river's western banks. At one such outpost, Boromir paused briefly. The guards recognized him at once and greeted him with respectful nods. A short exchange of news followed, little more than confirmation that the river remained quiet and that no enemy movements had been seen in recent days. Boromir thanked them and continued on. By afternoon, the hills began to rise gently along the western side of the valley. The road climbed gradually through wide fields, where the wind moved freely across the tall grass. To the east, the Anduin still shone broad and steady beneath the sky. Somewhere beyond those waters lay lands where the power of the enemy was growing. Boromir did not look that way for long. His road lay north, toward the lands of the Rohan. Though the borders of that kingdom lay some distance ahead, the character of the land had already begun to change. The open plains stretched wider now, and the air carried a different scent. Dry grass, distant horses, and the endless wind of the Mark. Boromir had visited Rohan before as a captain of Gondor. The riders of that land were proud allies, bound to Gondor by ancient oaths sworn long ago. Their people loved the open sky and the freedom of the plains, and their horses were among the finest in Middle-earth. As the sun began to sink toward the western hills, Boromir reached the crest of a long rise. From there, the view stretched far across the northern plains. The land rolled outward in gentle waves of grass and scattered trees, glowing gold beneath the fading light of evening. Far away, A small line of riders could be seen moving across the horizon, dark shapes against the wide sky. Riders of the Mark, perhaps. Boromir watched them for a moment. Even at that distance, their movement carried a sense of speed and freedom that was unmistakable. Then he turned his horse again toward the road. The riders soon vanished into the distance. Night approached slowly. Boromir chose a place to camp beside a low hill where a cluster of old trees offered shelter from the wind. The land there felt open and quiet, the kind of place where travelers could rest without fear of sudden danger. As darkness fell, the sky above the plains filled once more with stars. Boromir sat beside his small fire and looked north. The journey to Rivendell had only just begun. Ahead lay the wide lands of Rohan, the long, empty miles beyond, and the distant wilderness of the north, where few riders of Gondor had ever traveled. Yet Boromir felt no doubt. The dream had called him onto this road, and though the path might lead far from the lands he knew, he would follow it until the hidden valley of Rivendell was found. The wind moved gently across the plains as the fire burned low. Boromir wrapped his cloak around his shoulders and lay beneath the open sky. Tomorrow, the road would carry him into the wide lands of the Horse Lords, and beyond those lands, the long northern journey would truly begin. Morning rose wide and clear above the plains. When Boromir woke, the wind of the grasslands was already moving across the open country, bending the tall blades in long silver waves beneath the rising sun. The air carried a different scent now. Dry grass warmed by early light, distant water, and the faint, unmistakable smell of horses. The land had changed. He had crossed quietly from the southern reaches of Gondor into the northern plains, where the influence of Rohan could already be felt. The difference was subtle at first. There were fewer walls here. The fields were wider, stretching without boundary beneath the sky. The wind moved freely across the open land without the interruption of villages or stone fences. Boromir saddled his horse and resumed the road. The path north had grown little more than a pale track through the grass. Travelers passed this way often enough to keep the route visible, yet the land itself seemed far larger than any road that crossed it. For several hours, he rode alone. The wind whispered constantly through the grasslands, carrying the low sound of distant movement that could have been cattle, or perhaps the great horse herds for which the Mark was known. Boromir welcomed the open sky. Though he had spent much of his life among the towers and walls of the White City, he had always respected the people of Rohan and the wide freedom of their land. The Horse Lords were different from the men of Gondor in many ways, yet their loyalty had endured through centuries of war. By midday, he saw riders. They appeared first as small shapes along the crest of a distant hill. 3 figures moving swiftly across the plains. Their horses ran easily beneath them, long manes streaming in the wind. Boromir slowed his pace slightly. The riders approached without hesitation. Soon their shapes grew clearer. Tall men with fair hair beneath open helms, long spears carried upright in their hands. Their cloaks were green and brown, like the plains themselves, and the horses beneath them were strong and restless. Riders of the Mark. The 3 horsemen drew near and reined in their mounts a short distance away. For a moment, they studied Boromir silently. Then, the foremost rider spoke. "Traveler," he said in the language of the West, "you ride far north for a man of Gondor." Boromir inclined his head in greeting. You know me then? The rider smiled slightly. The white tree upon your cloak speaks clearly enough. Boromir recognized the calm confidence in the man's voice. These were not suspicious border guards, but riders accustomed to the open land. Men who judged travelers quickly and without unnecessary suspicion. I ride north on an errand of my house, Boromir said. The rider nodded thoughtfully. Toward the Northlands. Toward Rivendell. The three riders exchanged glances. Even among the horse lords, that name carried a certain weight. That is a long road, another of them said quietly. Boromir smiled faintly. So I have been told. The leader studied him a moment longer. Then he inclined his spear slightly in salute. Then may the wind of the plains guide your road, Captain of Gondor. Boromir returned the gesture. And may the horses of the mark run swift beneath your riders. The exchange was brief. Such was the way of travelers in the open lands. Soon the riders wheeled their horses and rode on across the plains, vanishing into the distance as swiftly as they had appeared. Boromir watched them go for a moment. There was something in the way the riders of Rohan moved across their land that spoke of deep harmony between horse and rider. It was not merely skill, but a kind of shared freedom that few other peoples possessed. Then he continued north. The day passed quietly. The plains stretched endlessly around him, rising and falling in gentle waves of grass beneath the sky. At times, he glimpsed distant herds moving across the hills, guided by small groups of riders whose cloaks blended almost perfectly with the color of the land. Toward evening, the wind grew stronger. Clouds drifted slowly across the western sky, turning gold and crimson as the sun descended toward the horizon. Boromir chose a camp beside a shallow stream where his horse could drink. The water ran cool and clear between banks of smooth stone, and a cluster of low trees offered shelter from the wind that swept across the plains. As darkness settled over the land, the world grew very quiet. No towers stood here. No walls. Only the vast open sky and the endless grasslands of the Mark. Boromir built a small fire and sat beside it, watching the last light fade from the horizon. His journey north had already carried him far from the White City, yet the road ahead was longer still. Beyond the plains of Rohan lay lands where the influence of Gondor and the Mark faded into distant memory. Old kingdoms had once risen in those regions, and their ruins still lingered among forests and hills. There Boromir would ride alone, toward rivers he had never crossed and valleys few men of the South had ever seen. Toward the hidden valley of Rivendell, where the dream had called him. The fire burned low. Above the plains, the stars shone bright and clear. Boromir wrapped his cloak about him and lay down beneath the wide sky. And as sleep came again, he wondered whether the dream would return, guiding his road ever farther into the deep north of Middle-earth. The next morning dawned pale and windswept over the plains of Rohan. When Boromir rose from his camp beside the small stream, the sky above the grasslands was vast and clear. A long band of silver cloud stretched along the eastern horizon, glowing softly in the early light. The wind had risen during the night, and it still moved steadily across the plains, bending the tall grass into slow, whispering waves. Boromir stood for a moment, beside the stream and looked north. There was something about the lands of the Mark that stirred a quiet respect in him. Gondor possessed great cities and ancient walls, but here there was another kind of strength. The strength of open sky and wide land, where riders could travel for days without seeing a single stone tower. It was a different way of living, one that suited the horse lords well. He saddled his horse and soon returned to the pale road that crossed the plains. The track was little more than a faint ribbon through the grass, yet it had been used by travelers for many years. Merchants, messengers, wandering riders of the Mark, and now a lone captain of Gondor, all had followed this path northward toward lands far beyond the familiar borders of their kingdoms. The morning passed quietly. Sometimes Boromir rode along the low ridges where the wind blew strongest. From those heights, the land seemed endless. The plains stretched toward the horizon in every direction, broken only by distant groves of trees or the faint lines of rivers winding through the grass. At other times, the road dipped into shallow valleys where streams flowed gently between banks of smooth stone. There, the air was cooler, and birds moved among the reeds beside the water. Once he passed a herd of horses grazing freely across the plain. They lifted their heads as he approached, dark manes tossing in the wind. For a moment they watched him with calm curiosity before turning once more to their grazing. Boromir smiled faintly. The people of Rohan were said to understand horses as few others did in Middle-earth. Even their wild herds seemed to carry a quiet dignity. By midday, the sky had grown brighter, and the wind eased slightly. Boromir rode at a steady pace, conserving both his own strength and that of his horse. The journey ahead would be long, and there was no need to hurry across these peaceful lands. Yet his thoughts often returned to the dream. The words had not come again in sleep, but they remained clear in memory. Seek for the sword that was broken. In Imladris it dwells. Boromir knew the old tales well enough to guess and part of their meaning. Long ago, the sword of Isildur had been broken in battle when the Dark Lord fell at the end of the Second Age. Fragments of that blade had passed into legend among the northern kingdoms. But what such an ancient relic had to do with Gondor's present troubles, Boromir did not yet understand. Perhaps the answer waited in Rivendell. The road continued north across the plains throughout the afternoon. Several times, Boromir glimpsed riders of the Mark moving across distant hills, though none approached closely. In such wide lands, travelers often kept their own paths, unless there was reason to meet. Toward evening, the plains began to change again. Low hills rose more frequently along the road, and the grass grew shorter where the soil turned stony beneath the surface. The wind carried a cooler edge now, hinting at lands farther north, where forests and rivers lay waiting. Boromir slowed his horse atop one of the hills. From there, he could see far across the plains of Rohan, stretching southward behind him. The golden grass shimmered beneath the setting sun, and distant herds moved like dark shadows across the land. It was a beautiful country. Yet Boromir knew his path would soon carry him beyond it. Ahead lay the northern reaches of the Mark, where the plains slowly gave way to rougher lands near the foothills of distant mountains. Few riders of Gondor had reason to travel there. Fewer still continued beyond those lands into the ancient regions of the north. Boromir urged his horse forward once more. The road descended toward a narrow valley where a small river crossed the plains. Trees grew along its banks, their leaves whispering softly in the evening wind. There, he chose to rest for the night. The routine of camp had already become familiar. The horse was unsaddled and allowed to drink from the river. A small fire was kindled beneath the shelter of the trees, and Boromir ate quietly while watching the fading light of day. The sky darkened slowly. Above the plains, the first stars appeared once more. Boromir leaned back against the trunk of a tree and listened to the sounds of the night, the gentle movement of the river, the rustle of wind in the branches, and the distant call of nightbirds across the open land. Somewhere far to the north lay the valley from his dream, a hidden place of wisdom, a place where the old powers of Middle-earth still lingered among the forests and mountains. Boromir did not yet know how many leagues remained between him and that valley, but he would ride them. The wind of the plains moved softly through the trees as the fire burned low, and beneath the quiet stars of Middle-earth, Boromir slept once more beside the long road that carried him ever closer to the hidden valley of Rivendell. The morning wind carried a cooler breath across the northern plains. When Boromir rose from his camp beside the small river, the land around him felt different from the days before. The wide golden fields of Rohan still stretched behind him, but ahead the plains began to break into rougher country. Low hills rolled across the horizon, their slopes scattered with stones and clusters of darker trees. The grass grew thinner here, and the wind carried the scent of distant forests. Boromir knew that he was nearing the northern edge of the mark. Beyond these lands, the roads of the Horse Lords faded into older paths, and the lands ahead belonged less to kingdoms and more to time itself. He saddled his horse and continued north. The road climbed gradually through the hills, winding between ridges where the wind swept strongly across the open ground. Several times, Boromir paused to look back. Far behind him, the plains of Rohan stretched wide and bright beneath the rising sun. Even from this distance, he could see faint movements of horse herds grazing across the grasslands. It was a land of freedom, a land where riders could cross the horizon without meeting a wall or tower. Boromir felt a quiet respect for it. Yet his road lay onward. By midday, the land had changed again. The hills grew steeper, and small forests appeared along the valleys, where streams cut through the earth. The road itself grew narrower and less certain, often little more than a worn trail winding between rocks and roots. Few travelers passed this way. The northern borders of the mark were not heavily settled, and the riders of Rohan preferred the wide southern plains where their horses could run freely. Boromir rode alone through the quiet hills. The sky remained clear above him, but the air felt cooler now, as though the breath of distant mountains had begun to reach this land. As he rode, his thoughts returned again to the dream. It had been many nights since the words had last come to him in sleep, yet he remembered them perfectly. Seek for the sword that was broken. In Imladris it dwells. The name Rivendell had begun to feel less like a distant legend and more like a destination that truly existed somewhere beyond the long miles of the north. Boromir had studied the maps before leaving Minas Tirith, though even the most careful maps of Gondor grew uncertain beyond the lands of Rohan. Old roads crossed those northern regions, remnants of kingdoms that had once flourished in ancient days. One of those lost realms had been Arnor, sister kingdom to Gondor in the early years of the world. But Arnor had fallen long ago. Now its lands lay scattered with ruins and forgotten watchtowers where only wind and grass remained. Boromir wondered what traces of that lost kingdom he might find along the road ahead. Toward evening, he reached the crest of a long ridge. From there, the view opened northward in a way that made him pause. The land ahead stretched in wide, rolling hills, broken by darker forests. In the far distance, faint blue shapes marked the rise of distant mountains, perhaps the southern reaches of the Misty Mountains themselves. Somewhere among those distant heights lay the hidden valley he sought. The thought stirred both anticipation and uncertainty within him. Boromir had traveled far from home already, yet the greater part of the journey still lay ahead. He urged his horse forward down the ridge. The road descended into a quiet valley where an old stone bridge crossed a narrow river. The bridge was ancient, its stones worn smooth by centuries of weather and travel. Boromir dismounted and examined the structure briefly. No recent travelers had passed here. Only the faint marks of hooves and wheels long faded by time remained upon the stone. The silence of the place felt deep and undisturbed. Boromir crossed the bridge and continued along the road as evening approached. Soon the valley opened into a small clearing where several ancient oak trees stood together beside the river. There he chose to make camp. The journey had already grown longer and more solitary than the roads of Gondor. Yet Boromir did not feel uneasy. He had spent much of his life riding patrol along lonely frontiers. The quiet of these northern lands carried no immediate threat, only distance. As darkness settled over the valley, Boromir lit a small fire beneath the oaks. The stars appeared slowly above the hills, bright and clear in the cool northern sky. The river beside the camp moved gently over stones, its quiet sound echoing through the trees. Boromir sat beside the fire and studied the maps he carried. The roads ahead were uncertain. He would soon leave the last familiar borders behind and enter lands that few riders of Gondor had walked for generations. Yet the dream had not led him this far without purpose. Somewhere beyond the hills and forests of the north waited the hidden valley of Rivendell. There, answers waited. Answers about the dream, about the sword that had been broken long ago, and perhaps about the growing shadow that threatened the lands of Middle-earth. The fire burned low as the night deepened. Boromir wrapped his cloak about him and lay beneath the shelter of the oaks. Above him, the stars wheeled slowly across the sky. And far to the north, beyond hills he had not yet crossed, the hidden valley of Rivendell waited in silence for the rider who followed the call of a dream. When Boromir opened his eyes, a thin veil of mist drifted above the small river beside his camp. The water moved softly around the stones, carrying the cool breath of the northern hills. For a moment he remained still, listening. The land was silent in a way that felt different from the plains of Rohan. There, the wind had always been moving, bending the grass in endless waves. Here, the hills and trees seemed to hold the air in quiet pockets, where even the smallest sounds could be heard clearly. A bird called somewhere among the branches overhead. Boromir rose slowly and began preparing for the day's ride. The journey had already carried him farther north than he had ever traveled before. Behind him lay the lands of Gondor and the open plains of the Mark. Ahead stretched regions that once belonged to the long-lost kingdom of Arnor. Now those lands were mostly empty. The road north from the small stone bridge soon led into a broad valley where the hills grew steeper and the forests thicker. Tall pines appeared among the oaks, their dark branches rising high against the pale sky. The air smelled of resin and damp earth. Boromir rode slowly through the forest path. Here the road had grown faint, often disappearing beneath fallen leaves and moss-covered stones. In places, he had to guide his horse carefully between roots and rocks where the old track wound through narrow passages. Yet signs of ancient travel still remained. From time to time, he glimpsed broken stone markers along the road. Weathered pillars half sunken into the earth. They were remnants of a time when the Northern Kingdom had kept these roads well guarded. Now they stood alone, silent reminders of a realm that had faded long ago. Boromir paused beside one of the markers. The stone was carved with faint patterns that had nearly worn away beneath centuries of wind and rain. Though he could not read the symbols clearly, he knew they belonged to the old Númenórean style, once shared by both Gondor and Arnor. For a moment, Boromir rested his hand upon the ancient stone. It felt strangely familiar. The men who had built this road had once been kin to the people of Gondor. Yet their kingdom had vanished, while Gondor endured. Boromir wondered how many travelers had passed this same place in the long years since Arnor's fall. Kings, messengers, wandering soldiers, perhaps even rangers who still guarded these northern lands in secret. The thought lingered briefly before he mounted his horse again. The forest thickened as the road climbed northward. By midday, the trees grew taller, and the light beneath their branches became cooler and dimmer. Moss covered many of the stones along the road, and the sound of the wind moved softly through the high canopy above. It was a quiet and ancient place. Boromir felt the weight of its years. Gondor was old by the reckoning of men. Yet these forests seemed older still, as though they had watched the rise and fall of kingdoms without changing their patient rhythm. In the afternoon, the road descended into another valley, where a clear stream crossed the path. Boromir allowed his horse to drink while he studied the land around him. The valley opened northward between two ridges of dark hills. A faint trail continued along the stream, winding deeper into the forest. Somewhere beyond those hills lay the hidden valley of Rivendell. Though he could not yet see it, Boromir felt that he was drawing closer. The air carried a different quality now, a freshness that seemed almost luminous beneath the forest shade. He mounted again and followed the stream north. The path grew steeper as it climbed into the hills. Waterfalls appeared among the rocks, their silver threads falling into quiet pools surrounded by ferns and moss. The forest canopy opened in places where sunlight reached the ground in long golden beams. It was a land of hidden beauty, very different from the open plains of Rohan or the stone cities of Gondor. As evening approached, Boromir reached the crest of a wooded ridge. Beyond it, the land descended into a wide valley, filled with tall trees and winding streams. The air there felt cooler and strangely peaceful. Boromir paused at the ridge and looked down across the valley. Though he saw no houses or towers, he sensed that the place ahead was not empty. Somewhere within those woods lay the refuge he had sought for so many days, the hidden valley of Rivendell. Yet night was already falling. Boromir chose a sheltered place among the trees where the road began its descent into the valley. There he made camp once more. The fire burned quietly beneath the branches, while darkness gathered among the forest hills. The sound of water moving through the valley below carried softly through the evening air. Boromir sat beside the fire and looked toward the shadowed valley. Tomorrow he would ride down into those woods, and somewhere within them he would find the halls of Elrond, where the dream had called him. For now, the forest rested in calm silence. The long road from Minas Tirith was nearly complete, and beneath the quiet stars above the northern hills, Boromir slept one final night before reaching the hidden refuge of Rivendell. When Boromir rose from his camp, the forest around him was filled with quiet light. The tall trees stood motionless in the still air, and thin strands of mist drifted slowly through the valley below the ridge. For a moment, he remained standing beside his horse, looking out across the land. Somewhere beneath that pale mist lay the hidden refuge of Rivendell. He felt certain of it now. The air carried a freshness unlike anything he had known along the long road north. The wind moved gently through the branches, and the distant sound of falling water echoed faintly through the valley. It was a place of quiet power. Boromir saddled his horse and began the descent. The road grew narrow as it wound down from the ridge, twisting between ancient trees whose roots gripped the earth like the fingers of old stone guardians. Moss covered many of the rocks beside the path, and small streams crossed the trail in clear ribbons of water. The deeper he rode into the valley, the more peaceful the land seemed to become. Birdsong echoed among the branches. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in soft green beams. Even the wind moved with gentle care, as though reluctant to disturb the calm of the place. Boromir had traveled far across Middle-earth in the service of Gondor, yet he had never seen a land quite like this. The forest felt alive in a different way. Not wild or dangerous like the deep woods of the north, but watchful and ancient, filled with a quiet awareness that seemed to greet every traveler who entered. The path curved along the side of a small waterfall. Clear water tumbled down a series of smooth stones before joining a narrow river that flowed through the heart of the valley. The sound of the water was constant, but gentle, like a distant song. Boromir followed the river. Soon the trees began to open slightly, revealing glimpses of pale stone structures set among the forest. At first they appeared only as shapes between the branches, graceful arches, slender pillars, terraces carved carefully into the rock beside the river. No walls surrounded them, and no towers rose above the trees. Instead, the buildings seemed to grow naturally from the valley itself. Boromir slowed his horse. He had reached the place from his dream, the hidden refuge of Elrond. A stone bridge crossed the river ahead. Its white surface reflected softly in the water below, and delicate carvings ran along its sides like flowing vines. As Boromir approached, the sound of voices reached him, quiet and musical, speaking in a language he did not know. Elves moved along the far side of the bridge. Their forms were tall and graceful, their cloaks light as the wind among the trees. Some carried small lanterns, though the day was bright, and others walked beside the river, speaking softly together. None seemed surprised by the arrival of a traveler. One of them stepped forward as Boromir reached the bridge. The elf regarded him with calm gray eyes. "Welcome, traveler of the south," he said in the common speech. "You have ridden far." Boromir inclined his head respectfully. "I seek the house of Elrond." The elf smiled gently. "You have found it." Boromir dismounted and led his horse across the bridge. The valley opened fully before him now. Terraces of pale stone followed the curve of the river, and long halls stood beneath the shelter of towering trees. Waterfalls glimmered among the cliffs above, feeding clear streams that wound through gardens filled with flowers, even in the cool northern air. It was not a fortress like the cities of men. It was something older and quieter. a place of rest and memory. Boromir felt the long weariness of the road settle upon him at last. He had ridden for many days across plains, hills, and forests. The journey had carried him farther from Minas Tirith than he had ever traveled before. Yet standing there in the calm light of Rivendell, the distance suddenly seemed less heavy. He followed the elf along a winding path beside the river. More elves passed them quietly, offering greetings with soft smiles. Their voices carried through the valley like music, blending with the constant sound of the water flowing over stone. At last, they reached a wide terrace overlooking the valley. There stood a tall figure clad in gray and silver robes. His dark hair fell upon his shoulders, and his face bore the calm wisdom of one who had seen many centuries pass. Boromir knew at once that this must be Elrond. The Lord of the Valley stepped forward. "You have ridden far, Boromir, son of Denethor," Elrond said gently. Boromir was surprised to hear his name spoken so easily. "You know me, my lord?" Elrond nodded slightly. "Your coming was not wholly unexpected." Boromir bowed respectfully. "I was guided here by a dream." Elrond's expression grew thoughtful. "Then the road has served its purpose." He gestured toward the valley behind him. "You have arrived at Rivendell in a time when many roads are leading here." Boromir followed his gaze. The hidden valley lay peaceful beneath the sunlight, yet there was a quiet sense of gathering in the air, as though travelers from distant lands would soon arrive with questions and burdens of their own. Elrond turned back toward him. "Come," he said kindly. "You shall rest now. The road you have ridden is long, and the days ahead may bring matters of great weight." Boromir nodded. At last the long journey from Gondor had reached its end. But as he followed the Lord of Rivendell into the hold of the valley, he could not help feeling that another journey, one far greater than the road he had ridden, was only beginning. Evening came softly to Rivendell. The sun slipped behind the western ridges, and long beams of golden light passed through the tall trees of the valley. The waterfalls that descended from the cliffs above shone like threads of silver in the fading day, and the clear waters of the Bruinen flowed quietly between banks of moss and stone. After the long road from Minas Tirith, Boromir felt the weight of travel settle gently upon him. The elves had led him through shaded paths into the heart of the valley, where halls of pale stone stood beneath the shelter of ancient trees. Unlike the fortress cities of men, these halls seemed almost to grow from the land itself. Arches opened toward gardens, and streams ran beside quiet walkways where lanterns would soon be lit. Boromir had never seen such a place. The calm of Rivendell felt deeper than simple peace. It was as if the valley itself remembered ages long past, and that memory shaped every stone and branch within its borders. Servants of the house guided him to a chamber overlooking the river. The room was simple yet beautiful. A wide window opened toward the valley, allowing the cool evening air to enter freely. The sound of the Bruinen could be heard below, flowing steadily over smooth stones. Boromir removed his travel cloak and set aside his sword. For many days, that blade had hung at his side along the long road north. Now, for the first time since leaving Gondor, he allowed himself to rest without the readiness of a soldier on patrol. Outside the window, the valley slowly changed with the coming of night. Lanterns were lit along the terraces. Soft music drifted faintly from distant halls where elves gathered beneath the trees. Their voices rose and fell like the wind moving through leaves, carrying melodies older than the kingdoms of men. Boromir stood at the window and watched the fading light. He thought of the journey behind him, the white towers of Gondor, the wide plains of Rohan, the long, silent forests of the north where the ruins of Arnor still lingered among the hills. Each league of that road had brought him farther from home, yet the dream that had guided him had led him true. Now he stood at last in the House of Elrond. Soon the reason for his journey would become clear. As darkness deepened over the valley, a servant came quietly to the doorway. "The Lord Elrond bids you come to the evening meal," the elf said gently. Boromir followed. They passed through long corridors where carved pillars rose like slender trees, supporting the roof above. Lamps glowed softly along the walls, casting warm light across floors of polished stone. Soon they reached a great hall open to the night air. There, many elves sat at tables beside the flowing river, speaking softly and sharing food beneath the rising stars. The atmosphere was calm and welcoming, yet Boromir sensed something deeper beneath the quiet gathering. Others had come to Rivendell, travelers from distant lands. Some he glimpsed among the hall's guests. Figures cloaked in gray, wandering men of the north, whose watchful eyes reminded him of soldiers, though they wore no armor. Rangers, perhaps, guardians of the lands that had once belonged to Arnor. Boromir took his seat among the guests. The food was simple, but rich. Fresh bread, fruits gathered from the valley gardens, and clear water drawn from the mountain streams. After the long journey, even such humble fare felt like a feast. For a time, Boromir simply listened. The voices of the elves carried through the hall like music, and the sound of the river blended gently with their speech. Peace rested in that place. Yet Boromir could not forget the shadow that had driven him from Gondor. The words of the dream still echoed in his memory. Seek for the sword that was broken. At last, Elrond rose from his seat. The hall grew quiet. "You have come from many roads," Elrond said calmly, his voice carrying across the terrace. "From lands both near and far." His eyes turned briefly toward Boromir. "The days ahead will bring counsel." Boromir listened carefully. Though Elrond spoke gently, there was a weight behind his words that hinted at the importance of the gathering soon to take place. Something greater than any single journey had drawn travelers here. A moment was approaching when the fate of many lands would be spoken of together. Guests began to depart toward their chambers as the night deepened over Rivendell. Boromir returned to the window of his room. The stars shone brightly above the valley now, reflected in the flowing waters of the Brinen. Lanterns glowed softly among the trees, and distant music still drifted through the air. The long road from Gondor had ended, yet Boromir felt that the path before him had only just begun. For soon a council would be held in this peaceful valley, and in that council, the destiny of Middle-earth would begin to take shape. Boromir rested at last. Outside, the hidden valley slept beneath the quiet stars, waiting for the dawn that would bring the gathering of the free peoples. And the rider who had followed the call of a dream would soon stand among them.